A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back to films I'm willing to talk about again. And now, for this exact occasion, let's go and take a little trip back to the past. 17 years. The same amount of time that has passed since Kaiju Force Neo, then called Wandov, was established. And so, for that long, I've had that name stuck with me. And a lot of other people. As I've certainly begun to promote the company's existence itself far more than the likes as I have done before. So by all accounts, there certainly were a lot of things that had happened in the year 2005. Various things that had happened. From wars around the world to a lot of recurring issues in politics. But then of course there comes the many other things out there. The announcement of the Sony's PlayStation 3, which would happen a year later in Japan and a while later in America. But by all accounts, do we necessarily have to talk a bit about 2005 for all the bad stuff that happened? Just like with what we have been doing in more recent years. Not necessarily. I mean, 2005 was just a bit more like what we should expect for a year and not for anything else. But nonetheless, it's about time that I actually go and talk a bit about the Madagascar series. So let's get started with the first film, and I will in fact talk about the others again in a little while. But until then, for a film in 2005 compared to many other releases that I've gotten to know about, this is certainly one that I actually saw in theaters. It was one of the first that I saw in theaters. And of course, my memories about going to the theaters to watch new films does go all the way back to the year 2003. The first ever time I saw a new film in the theater was Big Fish in 2003. And so, that was the first ever time. And I've been constantly told about that story since then. But in 2005, it was a bit of a different stretch. With companies of all sorts like Walt Disney, DreamWorks, Blue Sky Studios, and many others vying for dominance over the computer-generated image film world that had gone existent, especially with the big release and success of the Toy Story films. It had certainly gotten a lot of creativity juices flowing. It also gave people the idea to create kid-friendly films that were not like the dark ages of what the likes of Disney had given us, especially between 1972 and 1996. Those years especially were the darkest times to have ever existed from the Walt Disney Company. And if you thought that a lot of things out there were strange as they were, because the Walt Disney Company really needed to do a whole lot just to try and get their fan base together through such times like those, then you probably would have no idea what companies of all sorts that are nowadays competitors to Walt Disney are like. Because even though some have actually gone defunct since then, I mean, you will definitely be missed, Blue Sky Studios. Always missed. DreamWorks, on the other hand, though, proved to be a bit more than a massive competitor, especially with the long-running success of their Shrek films between 2001 and 2010. In 2005, however, it was a bit of a turning point because by this point they had already started projects of all sorts, like Shark Tale, for example, in 2004. But only a year later, they would give us something a little bit different. One that would actually turn out to be average at first, but has still become a well-known film by today's standards. If you were born within my exact generation in the mid to late 90s, then as a kid in the mid 2000s, you would have gotten to know about this film very well by this point. Madagascar. The film that of course stars the likes of pretty nice actors out there, from Ben Stiller and Chris Rock, who was the same guy that voices the same old Osmosis Jones, as I've talked about last year in films I should have talked about years ago. Season 1, that is, as I will be having a second season pretty soon. Until then, though, there of course were other actors out there, Jada Pinkett Smith, and who could ever forget the directors of this film. Both of these guys had also doubled as roles in this film entirely. So it kind of is one of those things where the directors or producers or other such people that are responsible for creating the film also star as their own prominent roles within the film. It's kind of like how in more recent years when we got actors of all sorts whom are also directors and producers. This does in fact remind me of the time when Piranhas 3D in 2010, the director of that film had also starred a role in the film entirely. Mostly a minor role, but in any case though, this was at the time the first major example of how the directors of a film also star in their own way within the cast entirely. So that was a pretty amazing touch, and one that a lot of people did not necessarily know about at the time. But of course, you're probably just one of those that doesn't get to know about the credits. Because back then, the internet was not as huge, not even close. YouTube was only just made by PayPal and wouldn't even be bought out by Google for well over a year. In any case though, in the year 2005, it was a whole lot different back then as opposed to how it is today. With lots of things out there relating to web design, relating to online business, e-commerce platforms, and many other things out there. A lot of us are just a little bit more dependent on the internet nowadays compared to how we were nearly 20 years ago. Of course, I don't find myself within that category. Because with all the things that have been happening here in recent years compared to how things were 20 years ago, it just goes to show that the evolution of humanity, the many struggles to adapt to new life, and the many issues that we have to learn to tackle ourselves, they've just become a bit of a recurring issue. And by this point, I'm certainly not surprised at how we have certainly regressed this much. So by all means, do I consider Madagascar to be a great film? I can't be sure about that. The plot line is as simple as having 4 animals, a lion, zebra, hippo, and giraffe, all stranded together on an island. All 4 of these guys have to learn to live on this island without endangering each other, pretty much. It's that classic sort of survival example where a group of people whom are completely different and are only introduced at the point where they do in fact end up on the same land as each other. It's one of those examples. And I really do love this sort of touch. This sort of plot where multiple people come together as one and attempt to adapt to a new life out there on an island. Or by any means, just in any other sort of situation that they have to learn to fight against oncoming threats. Like starvation, thirst, boredom, or loneliness. There's a lot of things out there that I especially love about this exact sort of cliche. And as long as a film has a cliche like this, I will probably be more than just a sucker to watching it. As I've seen a lot of films like this before, and I'll probably never not see films like this again. Considering the fact that there probably will be more examples like this, I can't imagine what they might be like until, of course, I watch them. So, lots of things that pretty much happen here in this movie entirely. Madagascar shows a lot of things out there, tensions that happen between the 4. Even though they might become friends, they do in fact have to learn to live with each other. No matter what happens, their strengths and weaknesses show up, and over time, some things become pretty bad. They start to take a turn for the worse, especially at the point where Alex draws a line in the sand on the island's beachfront itself, suggesting that only Alex goes on one side and Marty goes on another, and they are never to cross that line ever again. That was pretty much the big breaking point between character developments. And of course, with actors like Ben Stiller and Chris Rock behind these voices, it comes as no surprise that there's a lot going into this one. And I really have seen lots of things like this happen. As a child, I really got to delve into the inner emotions of each character entirely. And being that this was a long time ago, I've since just known the many important parts of life are to learn to live with each other no matter who you are and what you are. We have to learn to accept each other's weaknesses, to accept one's strength, and don't use them for your own personal gain. And there's a lot of moments like those that do happen within this one movie entirely, which just goes to show that anything could happen. Good, bad, or ugly doesn't necessarily seem to kick in right away, but if you were to watch this film yourself, then and only then you'd pretty much get to know about it in the same way that I did in 2005 at the Marcus Theaters. So, this was way before I even went ahead and worked with them, but let's just not forget, there actually came along sequels to this one movie. And they were pretty much released timely within each other. Believe it or not though, there was actually plans to have more sequels. But unlike the many franchises out there that have already done so, like Transformers, Ice Age, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there unfortunately was never a fourth film ever made. They had plans to do so, but because of some infrastructure and other such things that they had to do, they had removed it from their schedule. So, as sad as it might sound, the third film from 2012 is all we'll ever have. Like I said, I'll talk about these other ones individually in their own respective episodes here in films I'm willing to talk about again. But until then, if you want to see more go down on my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.